What's your full name?
My full name, John Alden Clark.
Okay.
Without an E, C-L-A-R-K.
And what's your birth date?
I was born, the date of birth is July the 9th, 1923.
And where were you born?
In the University Hospital in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Okay.
I later became a member of the faculty and chairman of the department there some years later.
That's what your son told me. Yeah. Very good. And
that was not my home, but it was, my mother chose the hospital because my sister, a year older, had been born on the kitchen table in Detroit, and my mother put down no more of that. So we moved to the U Hospital in Ann Arbor.
Where were you when, when Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor?
On December 7th, 1941, I can tell you exactly. I was somewhere between Battle Creek, Michigan, and home in Royal Oak, Michigan. We had gone over there to visit my brother at Camp Custer, it was known in those days. He had just been drafted and was assigned to an army temporarily at Battle Creek, Michigan, Fort Custer. And when we got there, in those days there was no radio in the car and no telephone, and it was 1941. We didn't have those. When we arrived, the gates, which had normally been open, were closed. And there was an armed guard standing there. And he didn't tell us anything except, go away, the base is closed. Now, up until that time, we were in a peaceful mode. Visitors to Fort Custer were encouraged because it was good PR for the military. So this was a big change. And so we just had there were my father and my mother and 4 of us children. Well, I was teenagers, my sister was a year older. We were young children, but we had a Model A Ford, and we then drove more or less in silence all the way back 6 hours back to home, wondering what it was all about, Now, it didn't occur to us that there was a military emergency at all. So when we got back home, the first thing we did was to turn on WWII Detroit. And first thing we heard was, now WWII is an active station. It was audio was off. That was unusual, so we knew something was different. And then we heard background voices, people talking in the studio. And just a minute, I got the connection to Washington. We'll have them come on. And they announced, yes, ladies and gentlemen, we're momentarily going to hear from somebody in the War Department, it was called then, regarding the Pearl Harbor bombing. And that's was when we first heard the words used, the evening of December 7th. I had graduated from high school 6 months before, and I had been at a small school in Detroit, a technical school called Lawrence Tech. I had a scholarship to the University of Michigan, but the superintendent of schools in my home, Royal Oak, told my mother that he was not going to give it to me because he knew we couldn't afford to go anyway, and he didn't want to disappoint me to that extent. So I just did what I could, and I went to a small school in Detroit, and Lawrence Institute of Technology. Come back to that later if we want to, but so I was halfway through my first year at Pearl Harbor time. I had been interested in aviation since I can remember. I built models in those days, balsa wood models. I think of every aircraft that existed since the First World War. And my my total interest was flying. We had no family members that flew, but I just was very interested. I grew up, you see, in the time when aviation was the glamorous thing. It was the latest exercise in mankind's exploration. Maybe the children at the time of Columbus might have dreamed of sailing the blue, you know. So I built model airplanes. In fact, I won contests of models. And joining, in junior high school, my 9th grade project was to write everyone does, I think, an essay on how you want to, what do you want to be? Well, I wanted to be an Air Force pilot. Well, they call it Air Corps in those days. We lived not far from Selfridge Field. Did you ever hear of Selfridge Field?
Yeah, I think so.
In Mount Clemens. And the first fighter group was stationed there. And I would watch as a boy, 10 years old and so on, of the fighters out of Selfridge. And they were all dressed up in those days, blue fuselage, yellow wings. And they would fly over about 5 minutes from our house by P-12. Constantly, once a week or so, and relatively low altitude. So I look at those airplanes and just dream of ever being able to fly one. Turned out I did a lot more than that, but not as a child. I just was in love with aviation. It was kind of not unusual in those days. Lindbergh's flight was something we read over and over and over. Now I live 100 miles from where he was born, you know.
Yeah.
He's Minnesota here. So aviation was something I just thought about, dreamed about, and everything else. So when the war came, well, I was already basically concluded to be an Air Force, Air Corps, I call it then, pilot was what I would do. And so the next summer, I volunteered in August of '42 for the Army Air Corps. When that time came, I was also a first alternate for the appointment at West Point.
Oh, really?
Our congressman had suggested I had a good record in high school. After the 10th grade, I never got anything less than an A in all subjects. And so he knew his son, Don Darrow was his name, his son was in a high school band, and I knew him. So anyway, he suggested I take the exam for West Point. Sort of like a second insurance policy in a way. I had already volunteered, and in 1942, the Army Air Corps was just jammed with applicants. So I got a letter from, I think it was probably Wright Field, saying, thank you for joining the Army Air Corps. Your call will be delayed owing to the great pressure in flight training, which was true. So in the meantime, I had become first alternate for a West Point appointment. I had taken the exam, came to the 10th of a point, about 300 took the exam of getting the appointment. I think that was an act of God, because it was the best thing that ever happened to me was to not get the appointment. I didn't think about it that way at the time, of course. I'll tell you about that later if we have time, but more about it. So I then was called about, February, I got a letter from the U.S. Army, but the Air Corps was part of the Army then, saying that I should report blah, 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 and I did. So I entered service in April of '43 as a private. In those days, the Air Corps sent their candidates to regular 6 weeks of Army training. ended up in St. Louis, Fort Sheridan. No, not Sheridan. Forgotten now. Fort Sheridan was in Chicago. Oh, Jefferson Barracks.
Okay.
Called it Pneumonia Gulch. It was just rugged GI training, civilians right out of young 17, 18-year-olds, right out of civilian life, dumped into military training. Corporal teaching us how to march. The kind of a guy that you just hated his guts until afterwards. Then we thought he was a good guy. So that's how it started. From then I went into into Air Corps, and the Air Corps also had, after 6 weeks at Jefferson Barracks, learning to salute, learning to march, eat the bad food. I get used to the GI toilets in which there were 17 stools lined up like that, back to back. That was from private life as a civilian, that was an emotional shock. Anyway, they sent us off to 3 months of, they call it a college training detachment. The Air Corps used to have 2 years of college. They dropped that down to almost nothing when the war started. But they learned that a lot of the people did not have much advanced education. They had to have a high school diploma. So they sent the first round, the first stage, to a college. Beautiful campus in Iowa is where I went, to Cedar Falls. It didn't last long because at Jefferson Barracks, everyone took a general service exam. That's just some kind of a filter, I guess.
Yeah.
The dean called 3 of us in out of a class of about 300, and he said, there's no use you fellows being here. Most of us had college. He said, you 3 were the highest on a general service exam down at Jefferson Barracks, and there's nothing we can do here that would be of any value to the Air Force, so I'm sending you on to the next stage. The next stage was the real start. Classification at Santa Ana, where we spent another 6 weeks getting classified. Pilot, bombardier, navigator, or transfer to the infantry. I wanted to be a pilot, and that's how it worked out. And so I then went on to what they call primary flight training. You may be familiar with all that. 29 Palms, California, a Stearman, one of the nicest airplanes ever made by man. Then to Merced for basic in Balti vibrators. Each step was an increase in complexity. And then finally, to advanced twin-engine flight school at Stockton, California. At that stage, the decision had been made by the Air Force, not by us, that this class would be assigned to heavy bombers, because twin-engine meant you weren't going to fighter school. Everyone wanted to go to fighters. Twin-engine P-38s would be fine, but that was out of the question. So I finished it there and then went on to get transitioned into B-17s, 4-engine bombers at Las Vegas, Nevada. They were assigning us as co-pilots in 4-engine after transition at Las Vegas. The best thing that ever happened to me, because that's where I met my wife.
Yeah.
She was a WASP, and we flew fighters around Las Vegas for 6 weeks. You can keep that. That's a document that children and I prepared a year ago for a WASP gathering at Sweetwater, Texas. That's just a tribute to Marie. She's gone now. Been gone about 15 years. and she was flying fighters out of Las Vegas. And so we dated. That's how we met each other.
That's wonderful.
You turn it over. You see that little pin here on her right there?
Yeah.
That's Caterpillar Club. You ever hear of that?
No.
It's a club where if you parachuted in an emergency from a military aircraft, you became an automatic member of the Caterpillar Club because parachutes used to be made of silk. They're made by caterpillars, you know?
Yeah.
And so she's a member of that. About 6 other WASPs will get that. But she got about 1,000 hours in flight training, in flight real airplanes at Las Vegas. And come from West Des Moines, Iowa. She was national champion in flute in high school. She was a very cultured lady and interested in culture, and she added the real dimensions to our family. We were married 63 years. That's her signature. And the children and I thought we should honor her by this little document we took with us to Sweetwater last April for the, we printed 500 copies and left 400 of them for them. So anyway, then after Las Vegas, I had gotten my wings several months before, had about, what did I have? About 300 total hours, 50 hours in B-17s in transition. Then we were assigned, at that point, the Air Force had a very mature business of developing 4-engine flight crews. We were assigned, went to Omaha, Nebraska, assigned to a crew, and then we had 2 more months of B-17 transition in Texas, in Dyersburg, Tennessee. The crew got to know each other. We followed 8th Air Force techniques for 2 months, and at the end of August of '44, then we went back to Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska, and technically we bought a B-17. That meant technically we signed for it, and then were ordered to fly it to England from central United States, which we did, our whole crew. By that time, we'd gotten to know each other, the gunners, the navigator, the bombardier. I flew as co-pilot, and the pilot I was assigned to, which was a lucky thing for me, he had 2,000 hours in 4-engine as an instructor. Both B-24s and B-17s, so just about everything I ever really learned, I learned from Chuck. He didn't last long as our first pilot because when we hit the group in England, they learned about his background and he was immediately shifted, the whole crew was, to a lead crew. That meant that experienced pilots would lead the formation. The airborne commander then would sit where I would have sat, the right seat. And most co-pilots then were shifted to the tail gunner's position and became formation control officers. But I told our operations officer, I said, Major, I just joined the Air Force to be a pilot, not to be a substitute tail gunner. You're supposed to sit back there and advise the pilots who couldn't see the formation is falling apart or whatever. So I shifted to a flight crew and spent the rest of my time at the 100th as a co-pilot in a combat flight crew. Combat flying, the pilot and co-pilot, is not like an airline. Combat flying is shared because in formation, you just wear yourself out. And we would fly above 25,000 feet all the time. Sometimes half the other time it'd be about 35,000. And well, the oxygen we wore is still not the same as breathing air. You get tired after flying this aircraft for maybe 10 minutes, then we just hit the other fellow on the shoulder, he'd take over. So you'd have to trade things. The only difference really was that in decisions, the pilot made the final decision. He didn't share decision making. And every now and then we'd come to a situation where someone had to make a decision. Like, first time we had that, our fuel level was so low that should we try to get back to the base in England, or should we land and refuel at Brussels? At that time of the war, you could land there. The pilot said, we'll land. You could have stretched it, but this was probably at about November of the year, and the North Sea was awful cold. So that's the kind of decision. Later, with the other crew I was with, we crashed in Belgium, and as another fuel problem, and so the decision was made, we go this way or that way, and then that's it. So that's really the role of the co-pilot. To assist the pilot, you fly it half the time, take off half the time, land half the time, and so on. Mm-hmm. Anyway, then there's I flew 32 total missions, and they were telling you about the Christmas Eve mission. I didn't get quite through all of that, but
walk through that again.
Well,
as much as you want.
that was a mission that was called. We became aware of it about 2 hours before briefing on the day of Christmas Eve, 1944. We had been grounded in England because of weather, and normally we'd be flying over Germany in those days before Christmas, but the weather kept us grounded. In the meantime, the German army, how they ever decided to move at that time, advanced on Belgium, beginning what we call the Battle of the Bulge, almost the same time as we were grounded. We were grounded about the 10th of December, and that's the day they advanced. It was just a happenstance. I'm sure it was not planned. But anyway, they were making good headway. In the meantime, we were grounded. Almost all air operations in England and the edge of the continent where the Allied forces had gotten to were also grounded. So the Germans had the ground operations almost to themselves, and the American forces on the ground in Belgium were some of the least prepared troops. They went through them like hot knife through butter. And we knew all of this in England, sitting there day after day after day. So on the 23rd, about 1 o'clock in the morning of December, we got word by our indicator. We had indicating lights in the officers' club, like a traffic light, red, green, and yellow. The yellow light started to flash about 1 o'clock in the morning of Christmas Eve. We thought there was something wrong with the bulb, but then it came on steady, and then the light shifted, had been green for 10 days, it shifted to red. And I think it was about 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning, we first learned that we had a mission scheduled that day, which we did. And so we went through all the briefing, and in briefing, I learned that we were flying off the left wing of our lead ship. And flying off the left wing, a photographer, a person from the photographic lab, came up to me at briefing, knowing that I was the co-pilot of the airplane flying off his left wing, and he wanted to take pictures. He said, for 8th Air Force Public Relations. That was his assignment. And he was a professional photographer, maybe like you. And he said to me, you're off our left wing, could you bring your aircraft in as closely as you possibly could so I can get some good close-ups, he said, for 8th Air Force PR. So I said, Sergeant, I'll bring it in so you can see the rivets. And this picture in my book, maybe I'll put it here so you might see it, is taken by him of bringing it in to see the rivets. And if you look closely, you can see the rivets. That aircraft had 1 week to live. I flew with a crew, I changed to another crew. They took this airplane to Hamburg at the end of December. This was Christmas Eve, and it was shot down. And we lost 12 aircraft that day, too, as well. And I put this picture in here. That's General Frederick Castle. He was general of our wing. That's a very high-ranking position, brigadier general. And he knew the importance of that Christmas Eve mission was to the entire war effort. From our standpoint, it felt as though if the German army got as far as Antwerp, which they were headed for, that was the only port in the whole continent that would take ocean-going ships to supply American forces in Belgium and Holland. There were, of course, ports in France, but that's a long way away. And so Antwerp was the German objective, and they had to be stopped. And so General Castle, who would normally not fly, he had already flown missions, of course, but brigadier generals are never, they sometimes are. But out of 2,000 heavy bombers, 2 Messerschmitt fighters encountered his aircraft over Belgium and shot it down, and he was killed. And there were, 4,000 other pilots in that air mass, and he was the one that was killed. A very unusual thing. So I have put his picture in my book. This is my book, General Frederick Castle. He got the Congressional Medal of Honor for that attack. Well, now that is more or less a summary of what we did. I went on to fly about 20 other missions all over Western Germany. I think several of the missions were quite notable for things that happened and things that didn't happen to me. You probably have heard of the bombing of the city of Dresden.
Yeah.
Have you?
Yes.
And what do you know about it?
Not a whole lot, but that's it was flattened pretty well.
It was one of the, probably, if I could single out, the greatest blunder made by the Allied air units. That was the destruction of the city of Dresden. Dresden is in southeastern Germany, and for years, in the first several years of the war, it was known to be a free city, that is by the populace. A city that was never going to be bombed, an open city. It was also a city of great historic importance because it was a cultural icon and an ancient city. It was ancient, which meant it also was made mostly of wood. Well, on the 1st of February, the first 2 days of February, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill met at Yalta for a big conference. Part of the agreements at that conference, one of the series of mistakes I think the Allies made, but nevertheless the war was going, they worked out the political divisions of Eastern Europe to be all under Soviet rule, and to assist the Soviet armies who were in Eastern Europe advancing to German-occupied German countryside. The Soviet leader, Stalin, asked the Allied leaders to issue orders to their bomb groups to bomb 5 cities in Germany to help the advancement of the Soviet armies. Now, this is all what I've read about since, and I think it's quite true. So when the time came, after the Yalta Conference, both the Royal Air Force and the American Air Forces, American bombed in the day and the British at night, you probably know that, were given orders to destroy 5 cities in Germany, of which Dresden was one. In the morning then of February the 13th, 1945, the 100th Bomb Group, I was included in that, were briefed that morning, and I have it in my notes, to bomb one of 2 targets. Oftentimes we were given 2 targets. One's an alternate target, the other is the primary target. Alternate targets are chosen mostly because of weather for some reason. But we were briefed to bomb Dresden as the principal target that day, that morning, that daytime. And we had, I think, one other city as the alternate, but we were briefed then for Dresden. And we went through our usual routine, was to, after briefing, we went got our flight suits and went out to the aircraft, checked the aircraft, checked the fuel, checked the ammunition, and we're about ready to start the engines. We all have a time to do that. About 5 minutes before that time, we climb in, or probably had been in anyway, making sure that the engines were running and reasonably warm before we taxied out. But before we started the engines, the control tower, actually had a control van, fired a red flare, which meant we knew exactly. They fire a green flare if we proceed with takeoff. A red flare meant mission canceled. So we were flight crews. We didn't understand all what was going on upwards. Why were we canceled? It's just normal part of going. We don't ask, just get out of the airplane, go back. And I was lying on my bunk that afternoon, and I heard a characteristic sound, but I knew exactly what it was. It was the sound of Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that the British Lancasters, 4-engine bombers, flew, circling overhead, all afternoon long. And I wondered to myself, we were canceled, we were scrubbed, probably because of weather, but the Royal Air Force is going out, because they flew at night, Why? Well, that's just a question that never got answered at the time. In fact, I didn't know the answer for 17 years. And I learned that answer because in my work, I was a professor of engineering at Michigan. I did a lot of traveling around. I was in Europe. I think that I was consulting in nuclear at the time. My doctoral thesis at MIT was on the Nautilus submarine power plant. So I stayed with nuclear activities for quite a long time. But this was I guess I was involved with some nuclear work at the time in the States, and I wanted to visit German nuclear, because I'd done that previously. I had a sabbatical in Munich. And on the way, I landed at Frankfurt, on the way to a nuclear operation in the Munich area. It occurred to me, why don't I stop at one of the targets that the 8th Air Force had that was a disaster for the 8th. That would be Schweinfurt and Regensburg. You ever hear of those two?
Familiar, yep.
Yeah, those 2 targets, the 8th Air Force lost a third of its total force. That meant 2 other missions, there'd be no more Air Force. It was a crisis. The 8th Air Force lost 69 bombers to to German anti-aircraft and fighter activity. So I stopped at Schweinfurt, which was one of the targets, and what I wanted to do was to go to a newspaper office, speak to the editor, and see if he could show me copies of the newspapers that they had published just the day after that attack. Because in Germany, they were also historic attacks. Well, the editor was very cooperative. I didn't speak German well enough, and he realized that right away. He said, I'll assign one of our young reporters to help you go to our archives, dig out the newspapers, read the German for you, and then you'll get a full, your visit will be effective. So he did, and the young woman was there, and she was very cooperative. She dug out the newspaper reports of the newspaper on February the 14th, which is on Valentine's Day, 1945. And they had a spread of the effects of the attack. The ball-bearing plant at Schweinfurt was the target. They wanted to destroy the ball-bearing industry, if possible, rather critical items for almost everything they built that was warlike. And so the newspaper had this long report, and I read it, was very interested in learning about it. And then she said to me, she knew I was interested in what happened at Schweinfurt. She said, what do you know about Dresden? And that was a surprise to me. I wasn't there to talk about Dresden, but I said, well, I think porcelain comes from, I heard my mother talk about Dresden china, Dresden porcelain, high quality dinnerware, table settings, and so on. I learned a lot more about that later on, but anyway, she said, well, that's true, she said, but that's not what my mother thinks. She said my mother was at Dresden. Well, the way she said it, I knew that there was something big here. Being at Dresden was a code word, not intended, but just was. She said, I live a block from here. Why don't you come home with me and talk to my mother about Dresden? So I said yes. She said, just a block away, and my father and mother will be there. Her father was a contractor, and the yard had building material around it. And I went in, met her father, and then she called her mother into the room. Well, her mother walked slowly into the room, looked at me, and her daughter said, Muti, this man is an Allied bomber pilot, and he wants to know about Dresden. Her mother looked at me, turned around, and walked out. And her daughter said, I should apologize for my mother, but she was at Dresden the night in February of 45 when the Hauptbahnhof and the inner city were bombed and burned, and no one really knows how many people died that night, but the estimates run from 30,000 to 250,000. She said, let me show you some photographs, and that my mother had collected, and she had about 2 dozen, and there were stacks of bodies on wooden structures. It said it got so bad that they couldn't identify people anymore. They were just, they were rotting. So they had to burn them, and they burned hundreds of people in the central city. Because Dresden was thought to be a free city. And refugees from the eastern part of Germany all fled to Dresden because it was never going to be bombed. You know how people learn those things. And then the city was overcrowded with 200,000 more than the city normally had. And they're right in the middle of the firestorm. Now, a firestorm is not like a bonfire. It has the characteristics, of course, but in the ancient cities, the roads are not straight, they're narrow, and the buildings are all wood. And when the fire spreads, it draws in air from the surrounding countryside such that the streets become wind tunnels. When the bombing stopped and people moved out, they moved out into a whirlwind, 100-mile-an-hour winds, and were just sucked into the base of the fire. And people were found half burned, dead, all over the central part of the city. And it was just a terrible tragedy. She said, my mother has never gotten over that. So, that, we were scrubbed, we didn't fly it, but I put a chapter in here on Dresden because it's so important in the historic record. It was, well, I learned about an author who wrote a book, The Destruction of Dresden, which I got, a British author, and I read it, a very detailed account, not only of the attack itself. There were 2 attacks. The British technique, night bombing, would be to send an advance force, half of a total force, to bomb a location. 3 hours later, they send a second force because in the meantime, fire departments from around the cities would rush to the city that's burning and would be right in the city when the second wave hit. So Dresden had a 2-pronged attack. And so it was an important historic event. It was a blunder of the worst kind, but the author of the book made a phrase that I think is the right way: no praise, no blame, because it was a war, and wars get out of hand. Wars occur, perhaps even start on blunders, mistakes, misunderstandings, and then during the conflict itself, there's always some kind of intelligence services, both sides have them, but they're often wrong. And so the press, the governments, the Allied governments, actually suppressed this true story of the destruction of Dresden. Because the Germans, even the planning, you can see, if you just have a crude idea, the German city construction in the hundreds of years have learned that you never put an army through a city. And when railroads came, you never transport troops and equipment and supplies through the center of a city. You build freight route yards around the city. And all the major cities in Europe, I expect, Germany certainly, were built for military purposes as well as civilian purposes. And if they're going to destroy German army equipment, you wouldn't bomb the center of the city. And in Dresden, the Hauptbahnhof, which is German for the central railroad station, was in the center of the ancient city, virtually as the end of a line, not a pass-through line. There was one service freight line out of the center of the city to another part. So the targets that the Royal Air Force selected in the center of the city had no military significance at all. But that's where all the people were. That's where they went.
Do you think that was a request of the Russians? Or
Well, I don't think the Russians got involved with our tactics. but they said to destroy the cities so the armies would be held up.
Yeah.
They may have had a purpose in that. American leaders, they would issue orders from so far above the military commanders that issue of, well, but can we go through, or is that the best way? Probably never occurred to them. It was a war. We're closing in on it, and Yalta was the last major conference, and we could see the end of the war. It was just slaughter until they gave up. No, I don't think part of it was a result of the Royal Air Force had a different bombing technique than we had.
Being bombing at night still.
Well, yes, but the nature of their bombing. See, we bombed in mass formation. We have the Norden bomb site. We joke at it. You drop a bomb in a pickle barrel from 10,000 feet. It's a lot of baloney. Our mean circular air for the 8th Air Force with the Norden bomb site was 3 miles. Some people say 8 miles. That means half the bombs fell outside of 8 miles from the target and half fell within 8 miles from the target. 50%. I did on missions where we did better than that. We dropped them 14 miles from the target. So many things can happen. In our case, it was actually the Christmas Eve mission. We dropped 14 miles short because the lead bombardier had what they called extended vision cranked into the bomb site, which meant he was sighting 15 miles ahead, and he forgot to take it out. And so we all dropped on him. That's how you drop in those days, 14 miles short. So we never hit precision targets. Training as a bombardier in New Mexico from 10,000 feet on a clear, sunny afternoon in the wintertime in Arizona has no relationship to operating in wintertime from England. Half the time we had weather problems over the continent. Most of the time we really didn't know what the weather was at the target. And the British would send out mosquitoes, fighters, twin engines, ahead of time, and it was scout, advanced scouting for their Lancaster bombers. It did not come in formation, but came line by line at night. And they had a very elaborate scheme of dropping flares and so on in about a 6-mile, 10-mile diameter around the target. And the Royal Air Force pilots were just instructed to fly until you're sure your bombs are going to fall within that circle, and then go home. That was not precision bombing in our view. We did precision bombing much more precisely for a lot of reasons. I wouldn't go over those. Not all of them were humanitarian. Mostly we hit the target no matter what. And we had bombs that fall away from the target, of course. And Germany built their manufacturing plants right inside of cities. And if our job was to destroy a tank plant at Kassel, we had a drop on the plant and bombs scattered. So the civilians were injured by our activities, I know. But it's different than scatter bombing. In Dresden, once the drop into the center city and the fires start, then every other bomber drops on the flames. Mm-hmm. You can see them, or tries to. So that's why Dresden is here, and that's why I think it's such an important thing. It's a lesson that has a lesson. It's an event that has a lesson that probably has no meaning now, but because our bombs are chemical bombs anymore. Because do you know about the Tom Hanks series on the 8th Air Force?
Yeah, but they're in production now.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, they have finished filming. When that was started, it goes back 6, 7, 8 years. 5 of us out of the group were interviewed by Tom Hanks and his associate. when they were planning the movie, or the TV series is what it is, on Apple TV. So I proposed to our bomb group that they take advantage of the kind of momentum that series would generate and reprint both my book and my wife's book. I don't have it with me. And so they reprinted them, and they computerized them. And I'm told that the book isn't even available until they get it paid for, then they digitize it and get the book in, 5 minutes or whatever. So this is that digitized portion. And they put a separate sheet in it, which I've autographed, because I can't autograph the book that I don't even see. But all the funds that are obtained from that go to the foundation in both of our books. In fact, I don't think I've lost any more than about $30,000 in publishing our books. Probably more than that. There's no way to earn money, but in perpetuity, the group, the foundation gets it. My wife also wrote her book. I have that upstairs, but you can keep that if you want to.
A little briefly, what you did after the war. You mentioned working with the Saturn project, and I think you went to MIT.
Yes. Well, after the war, we were married in the summer of '45, and I had been 1 year plus a scattered half, maybe, at this small school in Detroit, technical school. I had worked as a designer draftsman of a machine tool company before the war, when I was about 17 or 18, and had a lot of responsibility in designing machinery, gears, all that stuff, with a very kindly head draftsman who guided me along the way. So I was settled pretty much into an engineering career. And so we went to the University of Michigan in August of '45 and enrolled there. They accepted my enrollment. And on the side, I happened to speak to the director of bands at Michigan. If you have any background in music, in collegiate music, you'll recognize Bill Ravelli, the Michigan Marching Band, really a famous group at the time. He gave a little talk to us newcomers. And I asked him if he had any ideas or an opening for a flute teacher, because Marie had been in the public schools in Des Moines for many years and had won the national championship in high school. And he said, "Oh, have her come and audition with me. A regular flute player is still in the Army, and we're looking for someone to just, boy, you get lucky, you know." So Marie, for the first year we were in Ann Arbor, was also working on a master's in music, but taught flute in the music school. So it worked out very well for her.
Wow. And
well, then at Michigan, I did 3 years. I had a year ahead of time. And what I learned was how poor the education was in engineering. A lot of pre-war faculty that were too lazy to do things. They had no research, really. They didn't ever publish anything. And some were so bad that they'd sit in a chair and write on the blackboard backwards just to demonstrate that one did that. And so I had learned in the meantime that the thing I was really interested in was taught by the world leaders at MIT. And so I applied there and was admitted. In the meantime, I flew with the Air National Guard. I talk about it here. And that's how I went around looking for jobs and getting into universities to fly. A-26 with a twin-engine Douglas. And because the National Guard we were told by our commanding officer, anytime you want to fly someplace in the continental United States, you just fill out a form. The Air Force is being cut back on fuel, but we're not. The guide units are local, you know, so Michigan, Arizona. So we have an edge on that. So I flew all over the country. If you ever get the hold of this book, be sure to read about the Rose Bowl game of 1948. I headed to Pasadena from Detroit for the Rose Bowl. And then coming back, the ice storm.
Michigan was playing.
Michigan will play, and they beat Southern Cal 48-0. No, 60-0.
Wow.
I didn't see the game. 5 officers that flew with me after a big problem in Fort Worth where we landed, they saw the game. But I was running landing gear checks all at New Year's Day of 49. So that's in here. So that's one thing I did. But when I got to MIT, National Guard activities, about the only thing we'd do was we'd attend the Boston Symphony Saturday night concerts, and that's about all I had time for. At MIT, they saying is going, "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be studying." And their motto is, "A little beaver, it's on the ring. It lives down by the river and works all day long." Any MIT student caught not studying is violating his principles. So you study all the time, but you're studying with men who are accomplished, world-known people, and so you're gaining everything that they have to teach you. So it was a great experience. I finished the master's, and then I worked on a doctor's degree. And in that doctor's degree is where I met Admiral Rickover. Who ever hear that name? He was chief of nuclear naval operations and head of the Nautilus submarine program. He was trying to drum up interest in the Navy for a nuclear Navy. And he was not popular amongst the naval brass. But so they assigned him 2 duties. One was chief of all nuclear operations of the Navy and chief of all submarine warfare development, which is exactly what he wanted, because he proposed then the Nautilus, which he came to MIT one time, and we met him, and he wanted us to conduct some research and dealing with the Nautilus power plant. Because a nuclear power plant is not like a diesel engine, it's not like a steam-powered plant. It's quite different. It's more like a light bulb. You can raise the power level on a light bulb only so far, and then all of a sudden, shoo, it burns out. In a nuclear, the burning out means it melts. Can you imagine a submarine with a power plant that's melting right out the bottom of the submarine? So our task to begin with was to set up an experiment, and by simulating the processes in the reactor itself, the heating of the pressurized water, how far we could go in power level before the plates would be covered with steam and then just burn out. The maximum power level of Nautilus. That was the principal goal. It led in hundreds of different directions. Later on, I left the project after about 5 years when I joined the faculty, regular teaching faculty. And I suspect today they're even wondering how far they can go. But I went in, kept nuclear in my mind. I went to the commercial end of things and consulted for 20 years with Westinghouse and other companies in nuclear. So that's what I did at MIT. Then I was a young assistant professor, and everyone tries to establish a niche, and So I began working on getting research contracts myself, and I shifted over to other levels of interest. Some associated with nuclear. For one thing, the dynamics of a nuclear reactor have never really been studied. In other words, if you're running one, what happens if you increase power level and the thing is still running? What's the response of that? Or if you have you're feeding the reactor with fluid that's changing its temperature, how does it affect the output temperature? That's called a transient response. So I moved into the introduction of the element of time into my field. Up to that time, there was not much really known on unsteady state processes, yet they're very common. In the industry, you start up a new system, it takes a while to get it all heated up, but no one quite knew what was going on in the meantime. So when I went to Michigan, I had that background and continued the efforts to study and set up a couple of labs and consulted. I had a long-term relation with the DuPont company in West Virginia because everyone thought I was a chemical engineer, but I wasn't. But my field was so close to that, thermodynamics and fluid mechanics. I still today I'm trying to develop a model of the Earth to look at the problem of climate change, which I do not support the public mind on that at all. And I think there's very good reason to say that people call it a hoax. I don't like that word, but misdirected. There's no crisis at all. None at all. And we don't, carbon control, we could use more carbon. You know how important carbon is to our lives? The whole photosynthesis process produces oxygen too, of course. This attack on carbon is vicious. If people know what they're doing, it is an evil, because it is not a crisis at all. We could even
I agree.
You could use more, burn more, and of course the fossil fuel is at the core of our industrial society. Mm-hmm. I worked on renewables, by the way, because I was on sabbatical in Berlin. I went twice to Europe for sabbaticals, a year in Munich at their labs in my field, and then 6 years later I went to Berlin and gave lectures in thermal radiation. You know what radiation is? You get before a heat lamp and you feel it. Mm-hmm. That's got to you by radiating. But that was in early 70s, and the crisis on energy was in the air. And so I thought, what is it I can do in my field that would deal with the energy problems in the country? Now, that led in a lot of directions. One of them was to take half-time president of a research firm in Detroit for 3 years on solar energy. So I came to the conclusion, well, the sun's energy comes to us by radiation, and I'm interested in the physics and design and all of that of radiation. I also was technical director of a solar energy company in the area. We installed more hot water heaters than any other company in Michigan, about 4,500. I was the head of design of all of that. It collapsed like they all did when they took off the subsidy. I was on the Reagan transition team, by the way, when he went for office in 1980 in the energy branch and did solar energy, and I recommended that the subsidies be dropped. That's what also put my own company out of business, because people had bought the systems and they were not economic, and so we financially supported a lot of private industry in those days with the subsidies. But when they were dropped, we were manufacturing for inventory for 6 weeks, until we just said we just can't do it. Anyway, I worked in the energy field. I put a lab in Michigan, a solar energy lab, and I taught 2 graduate courses in it. It was not very popular amongst the faculty because in the 70s, it was just a waste of time, you know. But I have always felt that if you want to really learn something, you should teach it. And if you want to learn the depth of it, teach it at the highest level you can. And I was dealing with the highest level in academia. The Michigan lab I had was well known throughout the world, and MIT speaks for itself. Incidentally, one of my graduate students became president of MIT, Chuck Vest. So that's how I was spending most of my time. And I'm still interested in the subject, and I think I got a handle on showing the futility of considering the energy problems to be lethal it's a political move.
Yeah.
But I developed a model I think is going to work, mostly for my own satisfaction, really. But I know why. The solar energy will never, the climate will never reach a crisis at all. If that was true, we would have met that crisis 100,000 years ago. There were times in the past, we have the historic record, and things are worse than today.
Yeah.
The human source of discharge into the atmosphere, we've had much higher CO2 concentrations times past. But the media is made up of ignorant reporters that are concerned mainly with striking a dramatic stance, you know.
Exactly.